Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Salatu wassalam ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. Amma ba'd. I thank you all for coming to, inshallah, the conclusion of the History of Islam series. I believe this is the 12th session. And of course, going really into a lot of detail about the history of Islam will require years, not just 12 sessions. But last week, we left off at the millennials. We spoke about Islam in America and the history of Islam in America, and that it begins well before the immigrant generation of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Rather, Islam has had a foot in America since even before the Christopher Columbus came to the new land, perhaps in the 9th century. Also, throughout the American experience or American history, you find that Muslims had a presence. That presence died out somewhere in the 1800s, obviously because a religion cannot be sustained without institutions for that religion, especially, primarily, the institution of the masjid. But subhanAllah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala willed it that in the early 1900s, Islam would spark once again through the groups of the Moorish Science Temple and Nation of Islam, both of which are extremely heterodox. They are outside the fold of Islam, but subhanAllah, Allah works His wisdom. It's through these two channels that Orthodox Islam would be rediscovered in America, and the Islam in America would gain a lot of traction. And I left off last week with the millennials and Generation Z. Just as a caveat, this is just my opinion. This is my own personal assessment. It could be very wrong, it could be very right, or it could be somewhere in between. So do not think that this is it and we must follow this as if it's coming directly from Quran and Sunnah. I would love to hear your feedback, maybe because this will be a shorter session. We can have some deeper discussions, Q&A. You can point out some things that you agree with, disagree with, concerns, questions, whatever it may be. So I know last week I went into a tangent about these two generations, and although it's not my intention to offend anyone, and no one came to me offended, but just in case someone watches the video and they are offended, I'm not trying to offend anyone. I'm just expressing my concern. To me, these two generations are very, very concerning because of many reasons. I pointed out some examples of that. So one thing I would like to change in the first point, since post 9/11, Muslim American activism has taken a sharp turn from conservative traditionalism to liberal culturalism. What I'd like to change, it's from conservative culturalism to liberal culturalism. Meaning the first generation of Muslims who came here, right, and I grew up under their leadership. Looking back now in retrospect, they really, really lacked knowledge. They were well intended and they did a lot of work that should not be overlooked nor should be underappreciated. But there was a lack of knowledge, and when there's a lack of knowledge, when presenting Islam, culture tends to take place of that void. So what's technically cultural becomes religion, right? And I grew up in a very conservative, and what still is a very conservative community. And I remember growing up, saying dad was like, whoa, that's like something against Islam. You have to say Baba, right? Even though it's the Arabic language. So, it's not that they meant to do wrong, it's just that they didn't know any better, right? And that is one of the side effects or the consequences of colonialism. I mean, this is a generation that's still trying to recover from colonialism and from the tyranny of the Muslim, or at least the Arab politicians. So conservative culturalism to liberal culturalism. And I do, as of now, I see the millennials, the Muslim millennials and Generation Z as being people who are following culture just as much as, the previous generation, which is really interesting because they're constantly, I'm one of this generation, but this generation is constantly criticizing the previous generation because of their culture. You are enforcing back home culture or Eastern culture on us. This is America, right? We need to understand religion from a non-cultural sense. But what you find, and you can really go into analysis, and details in this, that you find that there's a lot of American culture that's making its way into the Muslim community, right? Some of it is okay, meaning it's halal, but some of it is not. Or some of it is presented as if this is the position of Islam when really it's not, right? For example, I've heard several times people say, if the Prophet ﷺ if the Prophet ﷺ was here today, he would be a feminist. It's like, okay, look, we understand that feminism has certain, there's a very valuable and noble cause that they aspire towards, right? But there are other groups of feminism that it's not the case. And for us to say that the Prophet ﷺ would be a feminist just because the Prophet ﷺ cared about female issues or the issues regarding women back then, I mean, it's an incorrect or a premature conclusion to say that if the Prophet ﷺ was here today, he would be a feminist, or that he would be in the front of these rallies. Are you sure? If you're not sure, right, then you're just making these things up, and you could be held accountable for that. So yes, Muslims are to be proactive. Yes, Muslims are very much embedded and a part of society. They experience what society experiences. And yes, as we mentioned in the earlier sessions, Muslims for a good 300 years were a minority in Muslim lands, meaning in Muslim-governed lands, Muslims were a minority. Abu Hanifa was living in Iraq when Muslims were 20% of the population, and he was developing his fiqh, right? Imam Ahmad al-Shafi'i, this is where they were developing fiqh. Muslims are very much involved in whatever region they are in, whether they're majority Muslim or not. That's not the problem, right? But does that mean that the Prophet ﷺ would condone all that's going on today, or all these types of activisms? Not necessarily. So you find that these cultures are being forced upon the Sharia, and certain texts are being analyzed from this cultural lens, right? The Prophet ﷺ once said, for example, إِمَاطَةُ الْأَذَى عَنِ الطَّرِيقِ مِنَ الْإِيمَانِ, right? Removing some debris from the road is part of Iman. So they take this, and now, for example, environmental issues are a forefront issue of Muslims, right? Yes, Islam cares about the environment, right? But to what extent? What about the fiqh? They take these issues and make it as if this is the cause of Islam, and Islam is overly concerned or very much concerned with these things, and just because Islam, you have a few texts here and there, or scriptures, or verses, hadith, that mention these things, that automatically we become environmentalists, and we are pro all of the environmental causes, right? It's going too far, right, in a premature manner. We need to study. We're not for everything, right? Muslims are now becoming more and more ascribed to the Democratic Party, right? Fine, I understand that there is certain political strategies. That's not my concern. But does that mean Islam accepts everything that Democrats believe in, right? Does it mean that we reject everything conservatives or Republicans believe in, right? So you find that this culture is finding its way back into Islam, because when a person is not very knowledgeable about Islam, well, this is what happens. The void is filled through culture. That's quite natural. And also I mentioned, just to reiterate this point, to make sure that I said it clearly and the point gets across, and that is this outspokenness that millennials and Generation Z has. And this is, again, coming from the American culture. American culture is very much vocal, right? When something happens at the political level, the society is involved. And that's something good and healthy, right? But the problem, or the concern is, I should say, not problem, the concern is what happens when the people criticizing, right, are criticizing in a very immature manner, or in a manner that does not reflect intelligence and wisdom. Especially with social media, right, and a lot of da'wah going on in social media, and a lot of issues being brought up in social media. Literally now the only criteria you need to be a critic or an advocate or a scholar or whatever is the internet. If you have the internet, now you are somehow part of the game and you are involved. And sometimes these things get really out of hand, right? So you have now what's called the cancel culture. I was shocked when I saw this. I thought this was something going on in the Muslim community only. But to my surprise, CNN brought an article about cancel culture. One of the rappers said something and now they want to cancel him and whatever, right? This is how it is. Because through Facebook and social media, Instagram, whatever it is, Twitter, right? It just becomes this very, very vicious reaction to a mistake. It's not an acceptable mistake. It's not a mistake that we necessarily should look over. But how should we respond to it? Should every person go out and bring their stick and start, throwing? Or should we have an institution or a group of people who are qualified, sincere, and dedicated to dealing with these issues? There needs to be leadership. I mean, imagine, for example, if there wasn't this due process in the government. Today Trump was impeached, right? Now, it was very chaotic, and things were going left and right. But to an extent, there was a system, right? There was a system. Now, the Republicans, apparently all of them voted against this, right? But they didn't stop it to the extent that they overlooked the law, right? No doubt Trump broke the law. And although they are very much against the Democrats, the Republicans at least condoned a level of refutation, or not refutation, a level of, an amount of, and I'm losing the word, they allowed an amount to actually occur. He broke the law, yes, right? Yeah, we want him to be there because now it's more like tribalism, where this is our guy and that's not your guy, and we got at war with one another. But at the same time, there was a due process, there was a structure. It wasn't just people blurting things out left and right and everyone trying to take a swing at him. That would be absolute chaos, right? Even the protests that did happen, they were organized protests. Muslims are not organized. Anyone comes and it's just a fiasco, right? Left and right, and people start shouting things, and it becomes, oh my God. Like last month, it was crazy. You don't hear a lot of this. It comes to me, right? Because I'm part of that Imam's group, and we talk and we discuss these issues. It was absolute chaos last month in the Muslim community. Why? Because everyone just says whatever they want. There's no really respected leadership. There isn't. The Muslims don't go back to a leadership. Right? They might like a sheikh. That doesn't necessarily make the person in a leadership position where no one is going to do anything or no one can do anything until the leader speaks, right? So this is a big concern. And I link this type of mentality to the Khawarij. So the Prophet ﷺ describes the Khawarij in hadith as being hudatha al-asnan, sufaha al-ahlam. They are young in age, and they're very foolish. The way they act is very foolish. For example, ISIS wants to reestablish the Khilafah and wage war against the world. Do you realize what's happening here, right? Do you not understand the difference in power between you guys as a group of people in a failing state in Syria and Iraq, right? In two very volatile states, and you are going up against the entire world. You don't even have an economy, and you're trying to take over the world. You're trying to fight the world. I mean, what kind of insanity is this? This is what the Prophet ﷺ is saying. There's foolishness, right? And there's foolishness in the way people respond and react, and they are young in age. A lot, this generation, sure, they are growing. The millennials are now starting to take leadership positions, but does that mean that they are truly ready or qualified or experienced enough to take on really big issues? I mean, this is a question. A 20-year-old, no matter how smart they might be, no matter what kind of degree they have, they're not experienced enough to take on large leadership positions, right? They're just not. And I know because, I'm close to that age, and I know the difference between my 20s and now my 30s. I could see the difference. And me interacting with people in their 60s and 70s, I can see the difference, right? When I try, and subhanAllah, my teacher told me, my teacher's he knows people, right? He's very experienced. He's a bit older than me, right? He told me once that if he had an opinion to do something, I'm talking about worldly affairs, right? And he asked two experienced people, two people with experience, they know what to talk about in the subject, and both of them were to disagree with him. He said, I would change my mind. I would change my position. This is shura. There's a system of shura. It's not everyone trying to enact and enforce justice on their own. The millennials really need to take a breath, right? Gather themselves, and appreciate the experience of the older generation, right? Because they did accomplish, they did progress. It might not be ideal. We might not like everything that happened, right? Sure, fine. What generation does? When Generation Z grows up, they're going to start criticizing the millennials, and here goes the circle. Each one criticizes the one before, as you have no idea what you're doing, right? And by the way, this idea or this criticism is not coming directly from me or my own thoughts. Charles Taylor mentions this in his book, A Secular Age. He says that when these generation, one of the problems or the concerns of this new generation, right, and the lack of leadership or this over-independence and autonomy that they are enjoying and living on and thriving off of, right? What happens is each person tries to build a world, or each generation tries to build a world that caters to their specific needs, neglecting the needs of the previous generation and the one after. And therefore, when the next generation comes, they start criticizing the one before. You guys did not take care of us. You guys did not take care of our needs. Why? Because it's not very well founded. There isn't this foundation of an idea, a vision. It's just people thinking that this is what the world should be, and therefore that's what I'm going to promote. And whoever disagrees with me, then you are disagreeing with something very, very fundamental, right? And this is very similar to the Khawarij mentality. Why did the Khawarij go around excommunicating all the Muslims? Well, in a nutshell, because we don't agree with their point of view. We don't agree with their opinions. And therefore we are now non-Muslims because of that, right? And you find a similar extremism in this group, but where? On the other side of the ideological spectrum, right? I mean, I sometimes see these memes and these GIFs where, for example, someone is criticizing imams in America, and you have this very large tank of water, and it's cracked and water is gushing out, right? And they show a picture of an imam and just kind of taping it, right? Putting tape over the broken glass. Now, the idea is that the imam is not concerned enough with these issues, and they're just kind of putting a tape over it, and the tape is not going to stop a tank that is broken, or glass that is broken, right? They're kind of criticizing and making fun of imams, right? And that's the mentality. Oh, you guys don't know Islam right. Excuse me, how much of Islam did you study? Can you even tell me the basics of Islam? No, you can't. Then let us speak, right? You get a lot of criticism. The imams aren't saying enough, right? Someone said something and the imams didn't respond. Well, why didn't they respond? Out of laziness? Out of carelessness? Or out of maturity? They realize this is not the place to respond. Just because imams aren't going crazy over Facebook and in their posts does not mean they're not addressing this issue at a different platform or a different level. Why do I need to yell, so-and-so did this and we need to go after him? When I can go to the person and say, you know what, this was incorrect, one-on-one basis, without canceling that individual, right? And for your generation, this is common sense. This is common sense. But for the millennials and Generation Z, this is a challenge. So an overview of Muslim Americans. American Muslims are more focused on becoming an accepted part of American society. And I believe, again, this is my personal opinion, I believe this led to the following things: sacrificing Islamic principles for the sake of integration and allyship, right? And what comes to mind is the issue of LGBT, right? So Muslim organizations, I should say. Muslim organizations are now more and more allying themselves with the LGBT community, right? And the idea is the following. Muslims are fighting for survival, right? Because the conservatives and the far right have chosen Muslims and Islam as a pawn in their political game. And their rhetoric has obviously and statistically speaking increased the amount of hate crimes towards Muslims. I mean, these are facts, these are statistics, right? And therefore, we need to build alliances with other minority communities who are being targeted as well, right? That's the idea here. Now, as a political strategy, that makes sense. That makes sense, right? As a political strategy. But as an Islamic, as Muslims, is this something acceptable, right? In other words, my question is the following. To what extent can we overlook our principles for the sake of worldly gain? Right? Now, this isn't a simple yes or no answer. It's a deep question, and it's a very valid question. To what extent, right? Now, if the situation of Muslims is dire, where it's life and death, something what's going on in India, for example, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala help our brothers and sisters in India, where now their citizenship is being threatened. Without citizenship, the spiral just goes down, right? That's a dire situation where this can be very much valid. But are we in America at the same level? No, that's a discussion to be had, right? And if we are not at that level, can we then justify not being friendly, right, with the LGBT community, not being concerned with their well-being? That's not what I'm talking about. But to what extent can we ignore their moral, our concerns with their morality and their behavior for our own gain? In other words, if the Prophet ﷺ was here, what would he be more concerned of? Getting the Muslims established in the state, or would he be concerned with their own well-being? Right? And I'm not going to answer that question because, again, this is a longer question. What I will say is the following. By building these alliances, we are essentially ignoring a spiritual problem of theirs that is further distancing them from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, if we as followers of the messengers, our primary goal, our primary mission as Muslims is to call people and invite them to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, can we then consider this to be a bad strategy or a failure to live up to our message? This is the questions I think we should be having. Now, again, going back to the very initial question, to what extent can we give up our principles, right, for the sake of integration, for the sake of worldly gain? Now, to me, obviously, being someone on the spiritual side, I'm going to say, well, that's a very limited. We're very limited in that scope. And I gave the khutbah, my last khutbah, and I talked about sticking to our principles, right, and the importance of that. And one of the ideas, or the ideas that the verse is sharing with us and telling us or suggesting, is that sometimes Muslims might feel a want to say a lie or take a false oath in order to increase our strength. Right? أَن تَكُونَ أُمَّةٌ هِيَ أَرْبَى مِنْ أُمَّةٍ. This is what it says, right? For one nation to be stronger or more in number than another nation. So you can imagine the Muslims in Mecca being in a state of weakness, right? Fighting for survival. That's what they were doing. Yet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, you do not have the right to take a false oath, right, in order to gain more power. So this is the perception that I'm coming from. And this is the evidence that I would use as of now. Now, sure, maybe over time, my opinion will evolve or change. Fine. That's why I'm not going to go about saying that those organizations who are doing this are deviants and they should be canceled, or they are disbelievers, or I'm not going to say that. I will say that I do disagree with you strongly, as of now, where I'm at now. Right? But that's the position I am at, that we should be concerned with how this behavior is actually affecting them negatively, right? And by allying ourselves with them, we need to ask the question, are we reinforcing what they are doing and harming themselves, right? I think personally, there are many concerns there. But again, this isn't an easy, simple question to answer. Another thing I believe that this focus has led to is a shift. It shifted the focus of Islam from a religion about Allah to one about social justice. Now, social justice is no doubt part of our religion. It's undeniable. There are plenty of verses that talk about social issues. However, what is the level of social justice in our religion? Is it a fundamental part of our faith, or is it secondary to other fundamentals of the faith? Right? Again, I'm not saying it's not important. Everything in Islam is important. Removing a piece of trash from the road is important. Why? Because it's part of Iman. But what level of importance does that have? Is moving a piece of debris from the road equivalent to praying your 5 daily prayers? Of course not. So where does social justice find its place in the Islamic hierarchy? Right? Where is it? And you might think it's an obvious answer, but to some people it's not that obvious. I had a class with a professor, and a pretty known professor, not the most famous, but a pretty known professor. And in my assignments, I kept mentioning Tawheed, right? Worshipping Allah, this is the most important thing. And in one of the class sessions, he said that someone keeps writing that Tawheed is the most important thing in Islam, right? It's not, it's social justice, right? And I was shocked. This does happen. Right? Now, how can someone say that? When the Quran from A to Z, from Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen to Min al-Jinnati wan Nas, from the first verse to the last verse is all about Tawheed. And this is what the scholars say, from Imam Ghazali, Ibn Qayyim, and all the scholars say this, right? And if we acknowledge that, social justice becomes a tool for La ilaha illallah. In other words, if you were to analyze social justice in the Quran, you find that the story of Nuh addresses it, the story of Hud and Saleh and Lut and Shu'aib, the story of Musa, and even the story of the Prophet, right? They all address social issues. But what you find is the following. Every time Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about one of these social issues, social justice issues, He always relates it back to Him, subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? As if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that a person cannot truly have a strong and authentic relationship with Allah while they do injustices. Or another way to see it is that these social injustices are creating a barrier between the individual and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And therefore the goal of removing these social injustices is to get the person closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the first place, right? And I don't have time to go through all of the verses, but if you read Surah Hud and Surah Al-A'raf and Surah Al-Shu'ara, when Allah addresses these issues, right, there's always a theological element there. I'll give you one example. In Surah Al-Mutaffifin, right, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَيْلٌ لِلْمُطَفِّفِينَ الَّذِينَ إِذَا اكْتَالُوا عَلَى النَّاسِ يَسْتَوْفُونَ وَإِذَا كَالُوهُمْ أَوْ وَزَنُوهُمْ يُخْسِرُونَ أَلَا يَظُنُّ أَنَّ أُولَٰئِكَ مَبْعُوثُونَ لِيَوْمٍ عَظِيمٍ يَوْمَ يَقُومُ النَّاسُ لِرَبِّ الْعَالَمِينَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says about the mutaffifin. The mutaffifin are those who are unjust when it comes to scales. So if someone buys something from them, they put less amount, but they pay them, they charge them as if the full amount, right? Or if they buy something, they make sure that the person is giving them, a just amount, a fair amount. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, do these people not know that they are coming back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? There's theology behind it. We cannot bring about true social change without the theological element. And part of the social justice is to reinforce our theology in the first place, right? And Shaykh Yas al-Qadi gives a very, very beautiful lecture. And the example he uses is the amendment of 1918, I believe, when America tried to ban alcohol, right? They tried to ban alcohol. And what was the result? It was a disaster. You had mafias establish themselves to bootleg alcohol. It was chaos to the extent that they had to pass another amendment to remove the law. Right? Now, compare that to the reaction of the companions when alcohol was forbidden. As the companions describe, we were drinking, and when we heard the verse, right, the one who had alcohol in their hand, they spilled it. The one who had alcohol in their mouth, they spit it out. The one who had alcohol in their throat, they threw it up. The streets of Medina were flowing with wine, right? Now, I'm sorry, but the companions weren't more sophisticated than America in the early 1900s. They weren't more advanced than the Americans in the early 1900s. But the companions had aqeedah, and that gave them the vision, and that gave them the power and the motivation to actually enact these changes. Right? So we can tell ourselves that we are all about social justice, right? But if we don't have the theology to fuel that social justice or to motivate ourselves to enact it, then guess what? We're kidding ourselves, right? And as I mentioned in my last khutbah, right, we talk about social justice, and we're there, and we're on the front lines, and all these protests, and we're here to defend the rights of minorities and the dignity of minorities, and that's all great, right? But if you look at the average Muslim, they are just as corrupt as any other American in this country or this society, right? Muslims do not stand out. They don't. When a Muslim, an elected Muslim official is in whatever position they are in, or whatever house they are in, they turn out they have corruption behind them. They stole money, or they embezzled, or whatever it is. I mean, how can we come up and say we are the social justice warriors when we ourselves need social justice warriors to put us in check, right? We don't have the aqeedah to back up this claim. This is just my opinion, right? And another concern I have of this is what I mentioned when we spoke about the Abbasid era. Now, if you remember, one of the earlier sessions, the Abbasids they exploited the social grievances of the eastern part of the Muslim world in order to revolt against the Umayyads. What was that grievance? Right? Ahl al-Bayt, the household of the Prophet ﷺ. They would go around saying that our message is Quran, al-Kitab wa Sunnah, wa rida an Ahl al-Bayt. Our message is, our vision is the Quran, the Sunnah, and being pleased with the household of the Prophet ﷺ. Now, when you look at them, the generation that revolted, the Abbasids that revolted, right? Abu Muslim al-Khurasani and these people, they killed a lot of people. I highly doubt they were very concerned, if at all, with the household of the Prophet ﷺ. They just exploited that social sensitivity in order to gain a following. And this is something I am concerned with, that people will exploit the cultural sensitivities of America, and that is social justice. Americans are very, very sensitive in this regard, and they're very enthusiastic about it. The average American does care about social justice, right? And I'm afraid that some people will exploit this in order to gain a following or legitimacy. And in the end, they are just as corrupt as anyone else, as the people they are criticizing themselves. Or if they have alliances with other entities or organizations, and those organizations turn out to be corrupt, that they won't speak out, right? And then you see that double standards. We are enthusiastic about social justice when it's against our opposition, but we could care less about it when it's against our friends and allies. These are things that I am concerned with, and we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to protect us from it. A third concern that I have is that this shift led to criticism or neglect of classical scholarship and a call to pushing boundaries, right? Again, one of the cultural slogans today, and even Nike uses this, we're pushing boundaries, right? And look at commercials. You can get a lot of understanding where the American society is just through commercials. I mentioned one, I think last session, where it's about you have the right. You have the right to travel the road freely or without concern. You have the right to this, and you have the right to live fully. And you have the right, and then at the end says you have the right to buy body parts of your car that are authentic and well made. Okay, wait, we were just talking about social issues, and now we're talking about body parts for a car, right? It goes like that. Nike utilizes this. They all utilize this. Another one is some people will consider you too fat, too young, too old, too soft. And sure, yeah, some people do that, right? But where does it go afterwards? It just takes this really strange tangent to something that has nothing to do with what they're talking about. It's like, we care about your freedoms, so buy our stuff. Like Starbucks. Starbucks has, it's funny, on their cup, it says, would you like a free coffee cup or something like that, right? It says, then join our points program and buy from us, and we'll give you free coffee. It's like, wait, what? You're telling me, you're trying to encourage me, you're trying to attract me with free coffee, but I have to buy from you in order to get the free coffee, right? They play these type of games, and it's quite interesting. And one of them is we're pushing the status quo, pushing boundaries, right? Without asking the questions, well, are these boundaries that need to be pushed? And if we push it, to what extent? If we push it, is it going to go to a better place or not, or worse, right? It's very, again, immaturely used, right? We're going to push boundaries, and we make sure we have more women in scholarship, okay? Well, have you not looked at female scholarship in Islam, right? Have you not looked at that topic? Were they not there before? Let's say they weren't there. Were they forbidden from or prohibited from entering this field, right? What boundaries are you pushing? Well, there are no boundaries to push. It's open. No one's preventing women from entering the field of Islam or becoming a sheikha or giving lectures. I personally have never heard of someone telling a woman, you cannot teach Islam in the masjid. They might limit, right? Say, okay, you teach women, for example, or what. But I've never heard of people going out and saying women can't study Islam. Or if they study Islam, they cannot talk about Islam. Even Saudi Arabia, the most conservative country, maybe in the world, right? In Medina, in the Prophet ﷺ's mosque, in the women's section, don't they have chairs and they teach? The women. I haven't entered, obviously. But for those maybe who remember, right? In my class in Jordan, over 50% of the class, of the Sharia class, were women. Right? And you have women who are Quran teachers, who are fiqh teachers. I had 4 classes with 3 women teachers, right? So you find we're pushing boundaries. Well, does it need to be pushed? Or is it already where you want it to be? But you're just kind of spewing things out of your ignorance, right? And I've heard people say that, name me one female scholar in Islam or one woman who's teaching Islam today. Well, there are many women who are teaching Islam today, even in our communities here, right? Look at the ignorance. They kind of they have this fascination for something, and they imagine a world that's not really there. So, and part of it is all these scholars were corrupt, right? They were male scholars who were trying to shackle women and whatnot because you have this opinion over here, and you have people writing like dissertations about this. Male bias in tafsir. Okay, fine. Okay, for example, okay, what's your evidence? Where are you coming from? For example, so and so said that in this verse, أَوَمَنْ يُنَشَّأُ فِي الْحِلْيَةِ وَهُوَ فِي الْخِصَامِ غَيْرُ مُبِينٍ. Or is the one who beautifies themselves in jewelry and they are weak when it comes to debate and speech, right? Some scholars said that that's referring to women. Okay, fine. Let's consider that to be a biased opinion. Are there any other scholars who disagree with that opinion? Well, of course there are, yes. They say that it's the statues, right? The statues, they would put these ornaments on it, they beautify these statues, they put a hat, and they put, utur and these fragrances around it, and it cannot speak, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is criticizing these statues that they are worshipping, saying that they are incomplete. They cannot speak, and that is an attribute of incompletion. And you have to beautify it because they're so ugly, right? This is what you worship? So sure, there might be certain opinions that are, you can feel that bias or, that bias against women. But is that the only opinion out there? Or are there other scholars who disagree with that? Right? Would you find that there are scholars who disagree with that? Okay, fine. Let's say that this scholar had negative feelings towards women. Maybe he had a bad wife. You never know, right? That can affect us. Right? But you have other scholars who disagree with that. So when you look at the tradition as a whole, is it male-dominated or pro-male against women? Is the methodology that is implemented in order to derive rulings or understanding of Quran and Hadith, right? Is there female bias there? Or male bias there, I should say? These are the questions. These are the academic questions. As for just assuming because the ratio of male sheikhs to female sheikhs is not, it's very heavily in favor of males, does not make it a male-dominated religion. Or that males are biased or against women, or that they will use religion to, shackle women or imprison them or enslave them, right? So pushing boundaries, okay, well, it's very vague. Prophets have always been seen by their societies as being different. Meaning, we as Americans, as American Muslims, how concerned should we be in being part of, society, or being exactly the same as society, or being very accepted by society? To what extent? I'm not saying we shouldn't be, or we should be seen as these disobedient, rebellious group of people who are part of the American society. I'm not saying that, right? But to what extent do we sacrifice our religion or change our religion in order for it to be accepted by American ideology, right? To what extent? Well, the prophets were always seen as different. Every prophet was called insane. They were all called insane, right? Ya Salih qad kunta fina marjuwan qabla hada. The people of Salih told him, we were looking forward to you being one of our leaders in the future. What happened to you? Right? Or, they would tell the Prophet that Hubul or Lat or someone, one of their deities, put insanity in the mind of the Prophet ﷺ. They were always seen as different, right? But is that a problem? And why are we seen different? Because of our theology. Well, that should be something that we should be proud of. We have something to offer the world. It's not the opposite. I'm talking about religion specifically, not technology and worldly affairs, right? The shift in focus ignores the message of Islam and fundamentally shifted the purpose of da'wah. All the prophets began their da'wah with what? What is the phrase? Right? U'budullah ma lakum min ilahin ghayruh. Worship Allah, you have no gods besides Him. This was the opening of every single prophetic message from Adam alayhi until our last and final messenger alayhi. All of them spoke that. And that was their mission. That was their purpose. That was their role as a messenger, to call people to that. Now, that doesn't really happen very much. Or not as much as it should. At least not in America. Right? We need to truly revive the message, the purpose of our da'wah. And that is to call people to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Reimagining Muslim activism. The best form of activism is the activism of the prophets. I have a short article on Muslim Matters. You can look it up, called Prophets and Social Activism, I believe. You can look it up. I talk about it in more detail. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, say, this is my way. I invite to Allah with insight, meaning with knowledge. Knowledge of the religion. And I and those who follow me, meaning the followers of the Prophet ﷺ are those who call people to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to do the da'wah, whether it's to Muslims or non-Muslims. And exalted is Allah, and I am not of those who associate others with Him. Here, this is my article, Prophets and Social Activism. You can look at it, Google it through Muslim Matters, or it's on my LinkedIn profile. No, this is not an advertisement for my LinkedIn profile. I just put my articles there because I don't know where else to store them. Muslim activism needs to be fueled by the theology of Tawheed with a vision of inviting greater society to it and strengthening the iman of Muslims with it. Right? What I mean by this is the following. When we do what we do at the various levels that we do it, whether it's at the political level, the humanitarian level, the communal level, whatever it is, our mission, our goal, our purpose should be fueled by La ilaha illallah. Meaning the reason I am doing this is out of submission to Allah, hoping to call others to that. Right? So it's not about fundamentally changing what we are doing. It's just reimagining, right, the purpose behind it. It's not just about social justice. Or another way to put it, social justice is more than just political and social affairs. It's also about theological affairs. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "Inna shirka la dhulmun azim." Shirk, worshipping other than Allah, is the greatest injustice. Look at the word Allah uses, injustice. We need to reimagine social activism as including theology. What greater injustice is there than for someone to worship other than Allah? And injustice against the self and against greater society. Because there's nothing worse a person can do to themselves or others than to sever the relationship of a people with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is the greatest harm you can bring to any person or any community. Because without Allah, right, you have these very strange and unfortunate consequences from, depression and mental illnesses, etc. I'm not denying the biological elements to that, but in my personal opinion, and this is some of the theories within psychology as well, that depression and these types of disorders, they are more rooted in behavior than they are in biology. And when a person does not have Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what do they have? All they have are fallible people to deal with and worldly possessions that will sooner or later fade away, or depreciate or lose their value, right? So, concluding remarks. So when we look at all of these sessions, all the information that we went through, all of Islamic history, I think these are four main remarks we can really appreciate. Number one, Islamic history, and this is in no particular order. Islamic history emphasizes the importance of balanced power and ideology. Meaning, if you look at the Muslim dynasties that were successful, or during the time that they were successful, whether it's the Umayyads, or the Abbasids, or the Ottomans, what made the polity very strong was a balance of power. And you see that consistently in the Umayyads, and then in the early part of the Abbasids, and in the first half of the Ottomans. Meaning what made the government strong was this balance of power. Now, how that balance of power manifested itself was different. It was different, right? So for the Ottomans, you had the four circles. You had the ruling class, the administrative class. You had the treasury, that was their own circle. You had the culture class, that was the ulama and the scholars. And you had the military, right? They had a balance of power, right? The administration did not have access to all institutions of the government or all departments of government. They had access to some, and some had access to others. You know, in America today, you have the judiciary branch, you have the executive branch, and the legislative branch. This is a balance of power, right? If all power was in the hands of the White House, well, Trump would not have been impeached, right? That's obvious. But this is the balance of power. So it's not about imitating a certain type of government. Rather, it's about building a government that has balanced power, where people keep each other in check. It has to be like that. And whenever the balance of power starts to disappear, this is when you have the tyranny come in. Why are the Arab the Arab presidents and kings so corrupt, right, and so tyrannical? Well, because everything is in their hands. Of course, they're going to come out that way. In fact, when the colonialists entered Islam, the Muslim world, I don't think I mentioned this. It's an important point. When the colonial powers entered the Muslim world, starting with Egypt, right, and started to fundamentally disunite the Muslim lands and create independent states, the political leaders, the elite class of that time took advantage of this change to do what? If you remember, throughout Islamic history, who was the greatest opposition to the political entity? Who was the opposition to the political leaders? Who was always in their face, annoying them?
Scholars?
The scholars. Remember that? Remember when I showed you the separation? The separation? You had the political realm, then you had the scholarship, right? The scholarly realm. They were in each other's face. And scholars were very much against being part of the political system because of spiritual corruption and because of the corruption in general, right? And therefore, they were very much embedded in greater society. They were part of society, and therefore the following was behind them. So if the political entity tried doing something shady, the scholars would rally up the society and do something about it, right? And at the same time, the political entity having, having judges, for example, and having military power, if the scholars got out of hand, they would keep them in check. This was a good balance. So they kept each other in check. So when the colonial powers entered, what these states started to do is they took advantage of this this void, this gap that was created by the colonialists, and this they took apart the religious institutions. So, for example, in Egypt, one of the first things the elites did was destroy the endowments. They are the ones who now took possession of the endowments. The endowments being waqf, right? These for example, it's a piece of land that has a lot of trees, it's a garden, and the fruits are sold, and that money is now used for a non-profit, what we call today a non-profit, like a masjid or a school, or whatever, a religious institution. And subhanAllah, this was so well utilized throughout Islamic history that a lot of the public services were for free. The hospitals were free, education was free, all this was free. But there was also another idea behind it. The scholars wanted waqf or promoted waqf a lot, not just because it is something that is pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but also because it limits the amount of revenue entering the government. And with a limited amount of income, it limits the power of the government. Does that make sense? Because money is power. If the government has a lot of money, now they have a lot more influence and power over the civilization. So by making these awqaf, they don't really need the government, not that much, right? There's not a call for anarchy, but it really limited the influence and the power that the government had. So when the colonialists entered, they started taking that apart. And to the extent where Azhar, right, the great school of Al-Azhar, which is still here today, it was previously completely independent from the government. And you had the greatest scholars of that time, right, being produced through Al-Azhar. And all the money was coming from endowments. But what happened? The endowments were taken over, right, and they were no longer sending its revenue to the Al-Azhar, and then it gave a chance, an opportunity for the government to put their hands on Al-Azhar. Now Shaykh Al-Azhar, right, who was once the most knowledgeable scholar on the face of this planet, is now most likely someone part of the intelligence agency of Egypt, right? They plant him there. This is what happened. So balance of power and balance in ideology. We need to be balanced in ideology. It's not just the extremists out there. There's also an extreme left. And Jordan Peterson mentions something very interesting. He says that, Jordan Peterson is a scholar, I think he's in Canada. He has a lot of YouTube videos. He says that when you look at conservatives, right, there's no doubt a fundamental part of the conservative group, right? There are extremists on the conservative side of the ideological spectrum. And that extremist group, we can put a box around them and easily classify them. These are the extremists from that side. But when you look at the liberal end, we can't do the same thing. Meaning society has yet to identify an extremist version of liberalism. Now, can a liberal be extremist? Yes, look at Europe. You have extremist liberal groups. I mean, France is a very liberal state, and it's very extreme. You see how it's limiting religious freedom with Muslims and wearing the veil ban and all that stuff, right? It's an extremist liberal state. So the liberal end of ideology can be extreme, but we have yet to put a box around these are the extremists of that side, right? So a balance in ideology. The second thing is the role of commanding good and forbidding evil. Now, we all know this concept, and it's very much in the Quran. But when we tend to think of it, at the very basic level, meaning it's the sheikh or some practicing brother or sister going to someone who's doing something wrong and saying, you know what, this is against Islam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants good for you, etc., in a nice way. But there's also, I think, another very important element of this. And that is when the leadership amongst each other do this to one another. Meaning, I, for example, as Imam of OCIF, I have a relationship with the masjid, the next closest masjid, with the Imam over there, right? Part of that relationship is that if that Imam says something incorrect, I go to them and I say, you know what, this is not right. And he does the same for me, right? So we're doing Amr bil Ma'ruf and Nahy an Munkar to one another, right? In a way that keeps us within that balanced realm, the realm of balance, ideology and power, right? So we shouldn't view constructive criticism of one another as being a type of attack. Rather, we should view it as being Amr bil Ma'ruf and Nahy an Munkar, commanding good and forbidding evil. It's not about overpowering someone I disagree with. It is about showing them that there is something better that is more in line with Quran and Hadith, right? So what you find is that although the scholars, for example, I'm just using the scholars here as an example, they criticized one another and they disagreed with one another. But it is through that disagreement that actually brought them closer, in a way. It brought them closer. Why? Because undoubtedly when people discuss, they refine their presumptions. They change their presumptions. They modify their ideas. By default, that's just the nature of discussion, right? So Charles Taylor has this idea of, it's not his idea, but he points to Western Europe as it was going through its renaissance, that one of the things that helped European society really advance is this thing called the public sphere. Now, the public sphere is about groups of individuals, normally skilled or professional individuals, scholars, come together and they discuss from amongst each other, from amongst one another. They discuss. What happens is the following. In a world where, or for Europe, people were very much disconnected with one another and they were disunited, even at the most simple levels. So with that, you find that the ideological spectrum is this wide, right? Now, someone who's over here will not see eye to eye with someone who's over here. Just like today, the Democrats and the conservatives are becoming more to the left and more to the right, and it's harder for them to see eye to eye. Now, with a public sphere, with them getting together, discussing ideas, debating one another, critiquing one another, what happens is this spectrum shrinks. Now, of course, you cannot completely remove disagreement, but someone who's here can easily see eye to eye with someone who's here. Does that make sense? So this is kind of the idea of Amr bil Ma'ruf wa Nahy al Munkar. The third thing is Tawheed is the identity of Muslims and their driving force. And I just explained that in the previous slide. And finally, Muslims have always risen to the challenge and worked together to protect and advance Islam. You see this over and over and over again. And it's happening today, right? Islam doesn't die. Muslims don't just die out. They don't fade out. They might fade out from a region, but as a whole, they don't. You will always find Muslims who are stepping up to the challenge, working with one another in order to protect Islam, preserve it, and to advance it as well. Throughout all of Islamic history until our time today. And that is the promise of Allah that came to us through the Prophet ﷺ. لا تزال في أمتي طائفة ظاهرين على الحق. There will always be a group of Muslims around who are clearly on truth or on clear truth, right? There will always be that people. They are here today. Who are those people? Of course, that's what comes to your mind, right? Who are these people? Well, of course, they are the people who are most resemblant of the prophets. Those who are calling people to Tawheed in one way or another. It doesn't mean everyone has to go, Ya la ilaha illallah, and come to la ilaha illallah. It doesn't mean it's exactly like that. But their driving force, their motivation is to raise the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the name of Allah, and to call people to that. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. With that, we conclude the series. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to, let this be of good. Any good that came through this is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His tawfiq. And any bad that came from it, that is from me and from the shaitan. And I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive me and to overlook any of that. I thank you for your patience. I know it's a lot of information, but I hope it was of benefit to you. And I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make it a source of good for each and every one of us. So with that, we'll just have a Q&A for however long you want, or actually not however long, for the next 20 minutes, right? For the next 20 minutes. And again, I would love to hear your feedback on, especially these last two sessions. Critique me. Do Amr al-Ma'ruf and Nahy al-Munkar to me, right? I hold you responsible to that, and I won't take anything personally. If you think I went overboard on something, if you think I neglected certain issues or certain events or whatever, please do let me know. I don't plan on erasing this presentation. I hope that I can do it in more than one settings, inshallah. So, whoever has a question. Please.
Thank you for your in-depth analysis and providing such a knowledge. My question is, we as immigrants here off and on get reminded we have a purpose, and purpose is, of course, as you touched base, spreading dawah. What's the best form of spreading dawah easily for everyone to reach out with your coworkers or whoever,
Mhm.
in your neighborhood? And what do you suggest or recommend that can be having, impact as well as we do our share?
Right. I think, and this is my opinion, I think the best form of da'wah is your actions. And that truly came to light when 9/11 occurred. Um, for example, my father told me that when it happened, right, his company, he's been with the company for almost 40 years now. He said that they came to his defense saying that we know you and we know Muslims aren't like this, right? My dad is very punctual. Every day he prays Fajr, and right after Fajr he goes straight to work. So he's always the first one in, right? And I'm trying to be humble here just because he's my dad, but he has a lot of things that is praiseworthy in that regard. Another story, an individual said that when 9/11 happened, their neighbor sent their child with a shotgun at the front door. Hold on, no. To the front door, saying that we're here to protect you. There are some crazy people out there. And he said the only thing I would do is say hi, good morning, right? This goes a long way. Americans are very, their hearts are very much intact. And therefore, small gestures goes a long way with them, right? Just like the Prophet ﷺ teaches us, do not underestimate or do not really belittle even the smallest gift or the smallest kind deed, right? It can go a long way, and it very much does here in America. So the first step with non-Muslims and even with your family members, especially the kids, is actually living the principles of Islam, because the kids catch those contradictions so easily. And when they see their parents saying something and doing something else, it's not just, oh, my dad is, being my dad, or my mom's being my mom, or whatever. To them, it creates a series of doubts, right? Because at that point in their life, they are not able to reconcile between, they're not able to understand and process the contradictions of human behavior, right? So it starts off with action. And after that, there needs to be an amount of courage for us to actually go to people and say, we believe in La ilaha illallah. Right? We're not talking to pagans, we're talking to Christians. So we are able to have a much more fruitful conversation with them. We don't have to start at point one with them. Right? To us, it's, okay, you're almost there, right? You believe in Jesus, right? You believe in monotheism, you believe in the books, there's one more thing you need to do, and that's believe in the Prophet ﷺ, and believe that Isa ﷺ is a messenger of Allah and not divine. And the same thing with Jews, right? So there does need to be an amount of courage. Now, I know sometimes we're concerned, we're afraid, what negative reaction, but look, sometimes you have to take the punch. The Prophet ﷺ took a lot of punches. I'm talking metaphorically speaking here, right? So I think it's just braving up. Dawah is not a difficult thing. It just requires a type of commitment and motivation. Or not motivation, dedication. Because motivation goes up and down. Dedication, if we're dedicated to something, then it'll take us a long way. Does that answer your question?
In a way, yeah, the first part, what you said, goes with pretty much, regardless what faith you are following.
Mm-hmm.
So that doesn't really necessarily spread the message out, what makes you different,
Mm-hmm.
It's just being good. Okay, there are several good people in your neighborhood and all that, so how does
Right.
you stand?
You're right, and I did point to that earlier. Then you need that element of actually being vocal about how you're different.
Means reaching out.
Reaching out, letting know we are people. We are what it means to be a Muslim is La ilaha illallah. I once pointed this out to the Shura Council. They have that beautiful sign on the 22, I think, one of these freeways. It says that Muhammad was sent as a mercy of mankind, right? The billboard. I know people are sending images of that. So at a Shura Council meeting, what was it? They quoted one of the Prophet ﷺ's hadith. And I told them, that's great and all, but you can remove the name Muhammad and put Buddha there. It'll be the same exact thing, right? So yeah, I do agree with you. There needs to be an element of uniqueness that we make clear. Okay, yes, we agree with you in some things, but there are some things we are different in, right? And that is, primarily La ilaha illallah. We're the people who worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone, believe in His perfection, right? And so on. So yeah, there needs to be that vocal element. Yeah, you also have a question?
So this, about linear and the regeneration. Now these are, just Muslim-related issues they are facing, or this whole generation overall is facing, and how you see it? Is it very unique? All these challenges to the Muslim kids?
The challenges facing the Muslim youth are the same challenges facing the Christian and Jewish youth. The same thing, right? And that's because it goes back to secularism, liberalism, these type of isms that aren't always in line with religious ideology and religious doctrine. From another angle, a lot of the issues that the Muslims are becoming more and more adamant about are not religious in nature, technically not religious in nature. So the issue of the environment is not a theological issue. That is not to say that Islam isn't concerned with it, but it's not an issue of theology, and therefore anyone, even an atheist, can come about and say, I am concerned with the environment, right? But what is happening is that Muslims are living a culture, right? And that culture is dispassionate towards religious groups, right? Anyone who's part of America has a certain culture regardless of their background and their religion. So Muslims are part of that. They are part of the experience, and there's nothing wrong with that. My concern is that they are taking these cultural elements and making it religious issues, right? Yes, the environment is important. We should be concerned with the environment. The Prophet ﷺ, you can find some hadith or verses that recommend and promote environmental awareness, right? But is it an issue of theology? Meaning, let me put it in this way: if a Muslim were to never be involved in any of these protests or rallies or environmental issues, whatever you want to put there, but they are a Muslim who prays 5 times a day, and they fast Ramadan, and they give their zakah, and they stay away from the major sins, and they did their hajj, right? Are we to say that that Muslim is any less of a Muslim because they did not participate in those things? No, right? Now, are there virtues in participating in it? Yes. But if a Muslim were to be the most adamant environmental protector in the world, but doesn't pray 5 daily prayers, they're not going to do well in the next life. Do you see what I mean? So when the culture comes and makes Islam as if it's a social justice machine, right? It's no longer about salah, it's no longer about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's about this. In order to be a good Muslim, you have to do this. And if you're not doing this, you're not a good Muslim, right? That is a problem. That is an adulteration to the fundamentals of our religion, right? So one can't say that Muslims their problem is unique or their challenges are unique. They're not unique, right? But they are concerning. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. What you're saying is that for a Muslim, it affects a belief system, while in others.
No, I don't know what's going on in the Christian and the Jewish realm. I can only speak on the Muslims, right? But they're taking these issues and making it as if it's the point of the religion. Not that the religion isn't concerned with it. There's a difference between the two, right? The religion is concerned with our environmental issues. Does that make it the point of the religion? Not at all, right? And it goes back to the example I gave of that picture of the imam kind of putting a band-aid on a broken tank that's spewing out water, right? I mean, look at how contorted their understanding of Islam is. Yes, Jibril.
Now not really an expert in politics, and I don't really follow the news, but I sort of think that if Muslim politicians took a strong stance against the LGBT issue, like say, like really, like we don't agree with that and it's wrong, and not try to ally with them, that moderate Jews and Christians, which is probably very, very many in this country, would actually have a lot of respect for Muslims. So maybe it would be better for them. But what do you think?
In that regard, I'm not going to claim that I understand politics more than the Muslims who are very much involved in that, right? And it goes back to what I was saying. I respect and understand their point of view. And if they were to say that such a notion is ineffective, I wouldn't have any reason to disagree with them. Or at least I don't feel experienced enough or qualified enough to critique their position, right? And to me, it's not about being outspoken against LGBT issues. And in Islam, in our Sharia, Islam is not concerned with the behaviors of non-Muslims. Meaning, if a non-Muslim group were to view LGBT as being permissible according to their faith, whatever their faith might be, Islam does not deny them that, right? But it won't let them practice it in public, right? So, from a fiqh perspective, I am not concerned with whether or not Americans accept LGBT or not, right? Nor am I concerned about silencing them. I do not care about that. I'm talking as a faqih, right? As from a fiqh perspective. What I am concerned with, however, is how our alliance with them is reinforcing their behavior that is harmful to them. So imagine someone coming and saying, for example, a lady coming and saying, my husband abuses me, right? But we are building an alliance with, women who like to be abused. Now, I'm being very silly here, right? Let's just say there's a group and they have a lobby and everything, and women who are pro-abuse, right? And, is abuse harmful for the woman? Right? It is. Now, there might be political gains in aligning ourselves with them, but that doesn't change the fact that they're being harmed, right? Of course, if someone from that community were to come and say, oh my God, you're saying this and that, they're not going to accept what I'm saying, right? But what does research say? Is it harmful, biologically, medically, whatever, psychologically, etc.? This is what we're concerned with, right? So I wouldn't put too much trust or faith in any political group, right? Regardless of where they are in the spectrum. And earning respect or not, again, that shouldn't be our motivation. It should be promoting what Allah and His Messenger said, because we believe that is mercy for all of mankind. Now, I have time for one more question. Yes. What's your name?
Hashir.
Hashir?
Yeah. Okay. So, first of all, I really liked your series of lectures. I
Thank
found them
you.
really informative. But
Exactly.
the only piece of criticism I have
Sure.
was that I'd kind of like to see how the Muslims were in World War I and World War II, because those are kind of like turning points in the earth.
Right. It's funny, you're not the only one who posed this to me. Yeah, I don't know too much about that. Where they were. What I do know is that Europe, the Western world, pulled them into the wars to deplete whatever they had left in terms of economic resources, right? Because by then, the Ottoman Empire was seen as the sick man of Europe, if you remember that lecture, right? So we're just about, the last straw, putting that killing blow, as they say. But I don't know much about that. So perhaps in another lecture, inshallah, maybe we could do some other series about going more into depth about the Ottoman Empire, because that's definitely a topic that's gaining a lot of interest. I think there's some experts in our area, maybe have a little bit more information than me. Allah ta'ala alam. All right. Does anyone else have a question? The ladies were pretty quiet. No questions? Jibreel?
Yeah,
All right, go ahead.
It's just like, about social justice kind of activism, and I don't know about the environment thing, but just social justice in general. Do you think that actually, some things like that can actually be a recipe for conflict?
Can social justice be a recipe for conflict? Look, baking a cake wrong can technically can result in conflict, right? Apparently, there's a funny but sad story. These Arabs, when people get really bored, they do really insane things. But it said that some people from the Bedouins, they were kind of sitting and they were bored at night. So they said, hey guys, why don't we just make a problem? Just cause like a problem randomly, because they're bored. And they caused that problem, and it led to the death of 2 people, right? So anything can create conflict. And I don't think that such a mentality or position should prevent us from being involved. Who knows what will happen, right? It's hard to predict. So, I mean, even like billionaires will say that, part of my success was luck. I got lucky. I made the right thing at the right time, and that's just luck. Now, to translate that into Islamic terms, that's qadr. That's the qadr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He wanted it to be that way. So, I mean, it could be, it might not be. We work towards what we see as being right, and you never know. Maybe 20 years from now, the Muslims will look back and say, we were so ignorant. Or maybe 20 years from now, we'll say, man, that was a good strategy. Allahu alam. Allahu alam. Yes.
You just mentioned something with the cake, and it reminded me with the with the Supreme Court justice. I mean, they came down
Yes,
with
the cake. Mm-hmm.
A store that refuses
Right.
to. So I'm looking at that. It's more like all the way to the conservative right,
Mm-hmm.
just saying that no way, no, I'm not baking cake for you because you are same-sex marriage.
Mm-hmm.
If you're a Muslim and let's say you have a catering services and somebody approach you for that, in that perspective, wouldn't you just kind of like be open to do it for them, not that you condone what they do?
Of course.
Okay.
Of course. If someone from a behavioral group that we don't agree with comes and approaches you, what would the Prophet ﷺ do? I couldn't imagine him being any other way than polite and kind, and because he's sent as mercy, and he was kind and polite to people who wanted to kill him, right? So bake a cake and smile and say, enjoy your cake, right? That is a form of da'wah. And again, our Sharia, we don't enforce our Sharia on other people. We live in the society, right? And the society will choose for itself what it wants to choose. And it is not for us to dictate our morality on anyone else. Right? So I don't agree with the other side where we refuse, services or we treat them inappropriately. On the contrary, but at the same time, we cannot go and pat their backs. Right? Okay, last question.
Quick question. So you talked about older Generation Z, and the millennials.
Right.
Have you come across any effective ways to bridge gaps between generations?
To bridge gaps between the generations, I don't think it's a difficult task. It's about just coming together and actually having discussions, right? The immigrant generation had a role to play, and they played it. That role was to establish the institutions, like the masjid we are in today, right? Where would Islam be today without that? Now the millennials have a different role to play, right? But if they view the previous generation as being, you hindered our progress or you didn't do things right, and I mean, come on, no one predicted 9/11. The Muslims were acting in a way that 9/11 was not going to happen. Why? Because they didn't know what was going to happen. So in hindsight is 2020. Well, now it's obvious that we were doing some things incorrectly, right? But you can't blame them for not knowing that. What happened happened. That's the qadr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You just have to deal with it. Right?
Yeah, because I see some of the masajid, the younger generation is taking over, right? And they are kind of hesitant are not willing to get the older people involved.
Right.
And that's kind of,
They probably feel that they're irrelevant. Well, you have nothing to offer us, and that can be further from the truth.
true. Because I mean, my concern is that they are struggling to keep going forward at the same time as well, but they're still not willing to get them involved. Not
Right.
willing to-
I mean, I just consider that to be a lack of experience and immaturity, honestly. Right? Yeah. Hopefully they grow out of that. But experience is experience. Like, experience is experience. That's just the reality. And I think it's just simply silly to believe that the older generation are completely naive and dumb. And I mean, come on. They succeeded in many ways. Many ways. It's not easy. You know, this generation, the millennials, if I had the power, I'd force every single one of them to go live in a third world country for a year, at least a year. Well, they'll come back saluting the flag. I know, right? I know because I lived in Jordan for 7 years. Man, when I came back, you know, driving in the streets was like, oh man, alhamdulillah, I'm in a garden. Right? The simplest things became, man, alhamdulillah, and that's just the reality. Anyone who's lived in a third world country, right, and has come here and lived, they know what I'm talking about. You cannot appreciate what you have until you go live somewhere else. Right? Allah ta'ala alam, wa sallallahu ala Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in.